Hello, everyone. This is Robbie Ward. I'm a reporter with the Daily Journal in Tupelo, Mississippi, and this is election night for Mississippi's U.S. Senate primary race. And here to discuss the Republican primary with us is a fellow with the Brookings Institution, John Hudak, and he has done research on the congressional races in the 8 states voting this evening, and so he's going to discuss with us the race between 6-time incumbent Thad Cochran and his main challenger, Chris McDaniel. I certainly appreciate you joining us here this evening, John.
Thanks for having me, Robbie.
Well, first of all, there are 8 states facing or having primary elections today. What is it about Mississippi's race that makes it stand out from others?
So Mississippi's race is unique because one of the longest-serving United States senators is at risk, and that's not something that happens too often. It's certainly not something that necessarily happens every year. But this year, all eyes are on what's going on in Mississippi to see whether a very powerful, very long-serving, and for much of his career, very popular United States senator is going to survive, or whether the voters in Mississippi are going to tell him it's time for him to stay home.
Yeah, and I guess before we go any further, let me just point out to people out there watching, if you're signed in to Google Plus, you can type in questions and we can discuss the questions. But and so, John, you mentioned the long time that Senator Cochran has served in office. I mean, 6 terms in the U.S. Senate, and he served before that in the U.S. House of Representatives. I mean, in the last time he had serious competition in the Senate race, it was in 1984 against former Governor William Winter. I mean, traditionally, Mississippi U.S. senators, once they're elected, they've been elected for life or as long as they've wanted to serve. What type of political dynamics are going on in the country now that might change this for states like Mississippi?
So to put this into perspective, I think this is a really neat statistic. Thad Cochran's seat, this Senate seat that he currently holds, in the past 95 years, since 1919, only 4 people have held this seat, himself included. That's a remarkable amount of longevity for U.S. senators holding the same seat over a period of time. 4 men in 95 years. But it's not something that's uncommon. It's not something uncommon in Mississippi. The other Senate seat, Senator Wicker's seat, has been held by 5 different men, only 5 different men in the past 91 years. So it's something that's fairly traditional in the South in particular, but in Mississippi specifically. So what's happening that's putting a very popular senator at risk? And as you mentioned in your question, there are some national trends, some national dynamics that are affecting this race and races like it in very unique ways. And the primary reason, no pun intended, but the primary reason is that for years, for decades, for a century, serving a long time in the Senate was an asset. That was something that you hung your hat on. That was something that a senator like James Eastland, for instance, used as a means to get reelected. It's something Thad Cochran has used to get reelected. But now that's a liability. People have a very, and particularly conservatives, particularly Republicans, have a very anti-establishment motivation right now. They see long-serving members as entrenched, possibly corrupt, out of touch with voters, and we've seen over the past few election cycles long-serving U.S. senators get turned away, and this year it's Thad Cochran's turn, and it's part of what's changing within not just the electorate nationally, but within the Republican electorate specifically.
Well, but you know, in a state like Mississippi or other southern states, uh, I mean, what appeal does seniority or longevity even bring for a state with somebody that's been in office for, 36 years?
So there's two sides to this, and I can see both perspectives. One perspective is we need to get some fresh blood into Congress. We need people who are new to the scene, who maybe understand how Mississippi is working, a newer generation, how a newer generation of Mississippians want to see their state move forward. But the other side of it is that in Congress, and particularly in the Senate, seniority means so much that it means better committee assignments. It means the ability to move legislation more effectively, more efficiently. It means building the types of bridges and relationships with their colleagues that a new person just isn't able to do. But what's more, Mississippi right now is one of the youngest congressional delegations in the nation. That is, the House members, at least on the Republican side, are generally quite new. Most of them have come to Congress, come to the House, only in the past few elections. And even Senator Wicker, by Senate standards, is more junior, having come to the Senate in 2007. So what that means is that as a delegation, the state of Mississippi has very little pull in Congress, very little seniority, and that translates, with the exception of Senator Cochran. He holds all of the seniority, essentially.
Well, but also Benny Thompson, the Democrat in the 2nd District, but he was chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, but as long as the Republicans control the House, he has certainly less authority.
Oh, sure. When you're in the Senate and you're in the minority party, you have quite a bit more pull than when you're in the House and you're in the minority party. The House minority party is essentially neutered. And so when Congressman Thompson was in the majority, he had tremendous power and he was able to help Mississippi in extraordinary ways. That power is quite limited as a Democrat in a Republican-controlled House. But for Senator Cochran in the Senate, the dynamics are different, and even as a Republican, he's able to do quite a bit. And if the Republicans take the Senate majority after the election in November, he'll have even more power and even more clout to help Mississippi in terms of policy, in terms of federal spending as well.
Well, okay, so in this particular race, well, in terms of national politics, there's social and fiscal conservatism. So how do you think Mississippi compares kind of to the rest of the country in terms of the different types of conservatism?
So Mississippi, by any metric, is among the most conservative states in the U.S. The Republican Party is tremendously powerful. And not just mainstream Republicans, not New Jersey or Connecticut or New York style Republicans, but true social and fiscal conservatism. It's a place where the Tea Party thrives. It's a place where voters across the board want lower taxes, less government, less federal spending, and it's a place where regardless of party, conservatism really wins the day. And that's true in several states, but there are a few states that really come to the same level of conservatism as you see in Mississippi. I would say Oklahoma and Alabama, perhaps Utah, are in the same ballpark, but Mississippi is close to tops.
Well, so while Thad Cochran is certainly a conservative on many levels, most, I guess, political pundits, they would call him a moderate. Certainly, he doesn't have a hard line on a number of issues important to conservatives, although recently he has started to say how he's looking forward to repealing Obamacare, and he's also, he did make the votes that other Republicans did, but for a Republican like Thad Cochran, who a lot of people consider him a moderate Republican. How can someone like that continue to win re-election in Mississippi?
So I'll say, I think there are some people in Mississippi who consider Thad Cochran a moderate. Outside of Mississippi, that is certainly not the case. He is a true conservative by any empirical metric that political scientists like myself use. Like you said, his voting record is a conservative one. His policy positions are a conservative one. What I think makes Senator Cochran falsely appear moderate, is stylistic. He surely has a gentility about him. He has an old-style Southern way about him, which I think a lot of Mississippians can relate to and do relate to, and that is, even if you have a harsh thought, you don't necessarily have to have a harsh word. And as a result of that, he's not a bomb thrower. He's not the one spewing vitriol on the Senate floor or on a Sunday talk show. He has very strong conservative values, but he's not bombastic. And so I think the idea of that in order to be truly conservative, you have to be a mouthy conservative in the same way that liberals are that way. I think some think that the only way you can be a true liberal is if you're very loud about it, and neither of those are true, but it's something that's hurt Senator Cochran for sure.
Right, and I guess I think about the, I don't know, what was it, Alan Grayson in Florida, who's very, who was this, like you said, a very bombastic liberal, and certainly when I think about very conservative senators, of course.
So Ted Cruz or Rand Paul.
Ted Cruz. Ted, right. But I guess you don't have to be loud and have a megaphone. I mean, certainly you could. Senators speak through their votes.
I think that's right, and unfortunately, fewer people look at senators' votes and congressmen's votes in weighing the way that they judge them. Instead, what they're often looking at are Sunday talk shows, blogs, other outlets like that, and sometimes you don't see senators, and sometimes you don't see congressmen, and Senator Cochran is one of the people who doesn't really chase after media opportunities. Instead, he quietly goes about his business, and that business is representing Mississippi in a very conservative way. And I don't say that in any way to endorse Senator Cochran over Mr. McDaniel, but they're both very conservative individuals. They have very different styles about them, but they're both quite conservative.
Well, with Cochran being conservative in his voting record, I mean, do you think that Mississippi voters actually buy into attack ads against him from super PACs and also the McDaniel campaign that they call him a rhino, they call him a liberal. I mean, do you think this is actually believable to voters?
So what's interesting is that I think with the type of senator who isn't the loud and vocal senator puts him or herself at risk to fall victim to attack ads like that. So if you're not out there actively defending yourself or representing your views in a very public forum on a regular basis, in the way that Senator Cruz does and other more vocal senators do, then sometimes it allows voters to pause and think, maybe I don't know Senator so-and-so or Congressman so-and-so as much as I thought. And if they're seeing attack ads from one side, it becomes very challenging then, and it forces the candidate to fight back. And so what ends up happening is that's why we have ad wars. That's why there's constant bickering on every commercial break. I mean, I live in Virginia now, and we've had a couple of close Senate races, or competitive Senate and gubernatorial races, and of course it's a swing state. So I sort of feel the pain that I'm sure a lot of Mississippians are feeling right now, and that is constant barrages of attack advertising. And so what all that's to say that I think the senator who's not always putting himself out there runs the risk of people at least questioning whether attack ads are true. You know, run an attack ad against Ted Cruz and call him a liberal, and no one's going to believe it. But run an attack ad against a quiet senator and call him a liberal, and, you know, a few voters might actually think about it.
Right. Well, I mean, Mississippi's by every metric one of the poorest, if not the poorest, states in the country, and the U.S. Senate is one of the ways that the state has leveraged resources unavailable in other ways historically. So what really do Mississippians have at stake in the election today? So
Senator Cochran is able to deliver federal funding to Mississippi in a way that a junior senator cannot, in a way, for instance, that Senator Wicker cannot. And there's a very popular myth out there that earmarks in Congress have gone away. That earmarks have changed the way in which they have come about, that they've changed the way that they look, but earmarks still exist, and contracts and grants and cooperative agreements still go to a lot of states and a lot of congressional districts, and a lot of that money flows to states that have very powerful, very senior United States senators. And some may think that is a problem, that if we're sending a lot of federal money to Mississippi, then we really can't present ourselves as small government conservatives. But the reality of the situation is that that money's going somewhere. And Senator Cochran sees to it that Mississippi gets its fair share, and in reality, the numbers will tell you that Mississippi gets more than its fair share. And that's due in large part to having a senior senator. It's true in Alabama, it's true in South Carolina, it's true in a lot of states that have very senior senators. They're able to bring a lot of money home. That's what's at stake tonight. But what it also draws into focus is a clear division within the Republican Party, and there truly are individuals in the Republican Party who say, we're standing on principles about small government. I don't want the federal money. And if they don't want that, defeating Senator Cochran is a very effective way to send that message. If they do depend on federal spending, then Senator Cochran is clearly a better choice than any junior senator. It's not just something specific about Mr. McDaniel. It's true of any opponent.
But one thing McDaniel has said throughout his campaign is he will stand on principle. You know, he said that that there's too much compromise, that Senator Cochran hasn't led the fights, the charges, that kind of stuff. I mean, is there anything that the state would gain in having someone that does appear on those Sunday talk shows, somebody that does kind of stand with Ted Cruz and filibuster, but because if the state would lose in terms of power among the system, I mean, what would, I mean, is there anything that Mississippi would gain by choosing a new senator?
Well, I think for voters, and this is a pretty complicated question about what matters to voters, and so like I said, by metrics of federal spending, when you defeat a long-serving U.S. senator, you almost always reduce the amount of federal funding that you're able to get in the short to medium term. But at the same time, and increasingly so, as the more conservative elements of the Republican Party, particularly Tea Party influence, but other influences as well, look to principled stands as something that is absolutely essential. And even if you don't get anything palpable out of an exchange, out of a bill, out of a debate, at least you know that you're sticking by your principles. And I think, frankly, that's something that as someone who's lived both in the North for a long period of time and in the South for an extended period of time, I think Southerners in particular see that that idea of a principled stand as something that has value to it, has true value to it. And I think a lot of Mississippians will see tonight are going to vote for Mr. McDaniel in part because of that principled stand that carries with it maybe not a monetary value, but some other value that is important to the voter.
And so with McDaniel kind of coming out of nowhere, I mean, before October, people in the state legislature and people in Jones County, where he's from, I mean, they knew him, but outside of there, very few people knew him. What is it that's how can such an unknown candidate have a credible campaign against somebody like Thad Cochran?
So I would say that in this case, and it's true in other cases too, there are three important ingredients that make Mr. McDaniel as successful as he's been in this race. First, there has to be some sort of appetite for change among voters, and I think the increasing influence of the Tea Party, particularly in southern states, and the attention drawn to specific issues that the Tea Party is championing, it activates that hunger for change among voters. That is absolutely one of the most essential ingredients. Second, it never hurts to have outside money, and this Senate primary race has had tremendous amounts of outside money. I won't go so far as to say that money buys elections or outside money buys elections. I think if that was true, we would be talking about what President Romney is doing right now.
Right.
But not having money is a killer. And so you need to be able to raise money and have outside money just to stand a chance, particularly against a deep-pocketed, long-standing, entrenched incumbent opponent. And the last, though, and this should not be understated, is that the candidate has to have quality, especially against an incumbent. And so the only way you make it a competitive race is if you have the characteristics of being a good candidate, and that sounds very mushy. I guess that's sort of a mushy description, but someone who can give a hell of a stump speech, that's critical. Someone who's disciplined and stays on message and doesn't get sidetracked in a variety of ways. That's hard to do when you're running for office for the first time, when you're running for statewide office for the first time. And we've seen a lot of candidates fail miserably at it. Mr. McDaniel has not. And so those three forces have come together to make what should otherwise be a very non-competitive race. As you started out, Senator Cochran hasn't had a competitive race in 30 years. It turns that into a fairly competitive one.
Well, and you talked about, you said somebody needs to be a hell of a candidate and have resources. Well, McDaniel, he comes off as very polished. He had a talk radio program, and he said a couple of things that got him in trouble related to that. But
sure.
But I would say that his radio experience has helped him with his speaking, his rhetoric. But also, if you just look at him, I mean, he's a very clean-cut, handsome guy, middle-aged. And if you put him right next to Senator Cochran, obviously there's a physical contrast.
Yes.
And so, but also, McDaniel has received a significant amount of contributions from within Mississippi, but he's also been really buoyed by super PACs, and and of course PACs have always been involved in all levels of elections. But do you see a trend in terms of super PACs, particularly Tea Party kind of super PACs, having roles in elections like this?
Sure. So I'll start with the first part. The polish of a candidate and his quality is truly essential. And I think one of the best way, particularly for a Mississippian to think about this, one of the best ways is for even a conservative from Mississippi to take a step back and think about the 2012 presidential race. Most Mississippians voted for Governor Romney, and very few I mean, almost zero Republicans voted for President Obama. But to see those two, to watch either of their campaign speeches or to watch them both in a presidential debate, you saw a very high-quality candidate in President Obama. And a fairly poor candidate in Governor Romney, and that's regardless of your own positions, but just sort of taking a look at what those candidates are like as candidates, regardless of what their message is or your feelings about their message, that can mean a lot. And obviously it meant quite a bit in a lot of swing states for President Obama to have that kind of candidate quality. To your, it's true in races across the country, not just at the presidential level, but at the state level as well. And to your question about super PACs are interesting in the sense that they can appear to have quite a bit of influence in a given race, but they can also have very limited amounts of influence as well. But what they're very good at is finding opportunities. So a super PAC is not going to invest in a candidate who they don't think has much of a chance of winning. But as soon as these super PACs saw that Chris McDaniel was a quality candidate, that there was a chance that this was going to be a competitive race, that's when they jump in. And so then the question becomes, do the super PACs cause the outcome of the race, or are they there because they sort of foresaw the outcome? My guess is it's some combination of the two. But to say that super PACs are going to win the day for Mr. McDaniel, I think that's a bit of an overstatement, because there's quite a bit about those races, about that race before the super PACs that led to that money coming into the state.
Okay, and I see that we have a question from Rob Williams, and he was wondering, what do you see in the libertarian influence in the Republican Party going forward, but both in national politics and also in Mississippi?
So libertarian politics are so complicated, and it's really a great question and an important one. It's something I've looked at a bit, and at the Brookings Institution in general, we've looked at a bit on the blog that I'm the managing editor of, the FixGov blog, which I encourage everyone to visit. We've actually looked at this question of libertarians, and they're a bit hard to pin down, because there are people who have libertarian values, and those libertarian values often exist on certain issues and not on other issues. So to label someone a libertarian is very difficult. But the values that underpin libertarianism, the idea that we need smaller or less government, that government needs to stay out of Americans' lives, that definitely drives a lot of our understanding of what's going on in Republican Party politics right now. The person who stands up and says, I'm a tried and true libertarian, in every sense of the word, that person isn't going to do well, and that person's not going to do well in Mississippi. Mississippi is a state that prides itself on social values, and in a lot of ways, Mississippians want to see a very strong government role in enforcing those values on issues like same-sex marriage, on issues like abortion, on issues like religion in the classroom. They would like to see quite a bit of government intervention. A true libertarian despises that and says, no, the government should not be involved in any way, and it's up to individuals to make their own choices. And so understanding the influence of libertarianism is quite tough when you think of it in the broad perspective. But as you narrow it down to the idea that, oh, there are issues in which I think the government should stay out, and I want the candidate I support to also see the government role that way, that creates a dividing line in which a lot of Republican primary voters tend to judge their candidates. So there are some, as I said, some candidates who think the government should stay out of abortion politics, should stay out of gay marriage politics. That doesn't play well in some states. But the candidate who says, I don't think the government should be involved in healthcare or transportation, that has a lot more play in a lot of more traditionally conservative areas. And so I think the way we think about what libertarian is will drive our understanding of what libertarianism does.
Right. When I I was in Oxford, Mississippi on Sunday, and I happened to be in the same restaurant that Chris McDaniel was at, and he did kind of focus on the libertarian element, but when he kicked off his campaign in stopped in Tupelo, he actually made that stop at the American Family Association, which is very big on social values and morals, that they want to kind of set the tone for the country. So even someone in this Tea Party libertarian type of persona, is it almost essential for a libertarian-minded candidate in Mississippi to kind of still hold true to those social conservatism that's not necessarily associated with libertarianism?
So I think for a candidate to be effective, that is absolutely true. If you have a candidate, a Republican candidate, who stands for election and says, if a woman wants an abortion, that's her choice. If a gay couple wants to get married, that's their choice. They're not going to fare well in a Republican primary, and that's not a criticism of those positions. It's not an embrace of those positions. It's a reality of the values of a lot of Mississippians. And so because of that, I think what you end up having is sort of a hybrid libertarianism, which plays into what we think of as fairly traditional Southern republicanism right now as well. That is a very strict fiscal libertarianism and a more traditional value-based social policy perspective. And so what you end up having are people who technically can't be considered libertarians, but on a series of issues they have very strong libertarian views. And I think that's what we've seen in the modern Republican Party in the South as the true path to success. I think the closest thing we have in the U.S. Senate right now as a libertarian is Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. But Senator Paul, on a series of issues, has very traditional conservative, non-libertarian views. So abortion is one of them. And he explains that as saying that life is the primary objective, and so it does fit into a libertarian mindset, but that's not the view that, say, the Libertarian Party of the United States has, or a lot of people who pride themselves as being true libertarians. So what you have then is a traditional social conservatism that sees a role of government in enforcing values and norms, and then a fiscal conservatism that sees the capitalist free market is the way to enforce those values and norms, and very little role to play for government.
With I know that you are familiar with the recent scandal with there was this conservative blogger who took photos with of Senator Cochran's wife in a nursing home, and so certainly that's kind of made this race a little more salacious. But well before that, this race was considered one of the top races in the country to watch.
Yes.
And even with the scandal, it seems that didn't really take hold for very long. After a couple weeks, it's kind of faded into the background. What is it about this race that kind of creates that national media attention that Mississippi typically doesn't see?
Well, I'll say media loves a fight. Media loves, the non-traditional story. The storyline that is incumbent wins again, no one cares. Readers don't care, editors don't care, a lot of journalists don't care. It doesn't sell newspapers, it doesn't lead to web traffic. When incumbents get defeated, that's a real story. But the Mississippi race is unique and important in another important way, and it's actually something that I don't think has been discussed enough. In a lot of ways, yes, it's It is the clash of Tea Party values and establishment republicanism. That's sort of the standard storyline in a lot of Republican primary races throughout the country. So that doesn't make it neat. What makes it neat is you have two candidates who have a set of values that differ somewhat from each other, and both of those candidates are embracing their positions. They're embracing what they believe. Too often, I think, in American politics, it's true on the left and it's true on the right, we see candidates, when they come ready to stand for re-election, they take a look at the landscape and they say, all right, what values do I have to tweak a little bit? What positions do I have to run away from? What things do I have to embrace? That's not really what's happening, at least on the big issues in Mississippi. Senator Cochran, unlike some of his colleagues in the Senate, is embracing the fact that he brings home the bacon. He gets federal spending back to Mississippians and Mississippians who need it. And that's not, people on welfare, which a lot of people paint as the way that federal spending exists. It's money for military bases. It's money for shoreline redevelopment. It's money for a whole series of projects that help businesses, small and large. It helps oil companies. It helps a lot of segments of the Mississippi economy. And he sees that as a real benefit. Mr. McDaniel, on the other hand, sees federal spending as one of our nation's biggest problems. And so he's standing for election in a state that depends quite heavily on federal spending to balance the state books, for jobs to exist. And he says, I don't care about that. I care about principle, and my principles tell me that we need less government. So they're embracing very different views, particularly on the role of government and in spending in particular. And that's admirable. I think what it does is something that Mississippians should applaud and embrace and say, we don't have two flip-floppers in this race. We have two people who are standing on principle and saying to the voters, essentially, take it or leave it because this is who I am. You don't get that too often, and Mississippians got that in this race. And so I think the polls at the end of the day are going to show us where Mississippians stand, whether they stand with Senator Cochran or whether they want to change in terms of the embrace of issues.
Well, and you just hit on something that's been, I think it's one of the key issues in this primary election. Earmarks.
Yes.
People in Mississippi, they love him. They love them. If you look at universities, if you look at small communities, wastewater treatment facilities, economic development projects, just on and on and on. People have always said Thad Cochran is the guy that delivers. He brings home the bacon, and McDaniel's campaign has tried to turn that into a liability. But for a poor state like Mississippi, that it just does not have those resources that other states do. Why do earmarks, or pork as it's called? What's such the does it really deserve such a bad rap in a state like Mississippi?
So I write a lot on pork barrel politics. I have a new book out called Presidential Pork, which looks at presidents' abilities to engage in this sort of behavior, to bring home the bacon, to send money to key constituencies. But traditionally, we think of this as something that members of Congress do, that senators do. And it's more important than I think most people understand. A lot of people complain, a lot of people in state governments and in Republican-run state governments complain about the problem of earmarks, the problems of federal spending. But any person involved in budgeting in a state will tell you that it's really hard to balance the books without steady flows of federal money. And in a state like Mississippi that has several industries that depend quite heavily on the role of the federal government, among them, of course, is military, but there are a lot of research institutions, agriculture, marine issues, energy issues that that Mississippi depends quite a bit on. If you take all that federal funding away, it has some serious social effects. The federal government helps Mississippi with one of its most serious issues, which of course is poverty, and not just urban poverty, but rural poverty as well. If you take all that away, there's serious social effects, but there's serious budgetary effects for the state of Mississippi. And so if that money begins to trickle down, which eventually will happen, because Senator Cochran will eventually no longer be senator, whether it's after the election in November or whether it's 6 years from now, it's a reality. And so the way that states respond to that becomes a real challenge. And I think people always see pork as a real evil, or at least some people see pork as a real evil. But in other ways, governors, Republican legislatures, Democratic governors and Democratic legislatures really depend on it in a pretty substantial way. And so it is a pretty big issue that most people don't see the big picture about. They see it as something that is an easy talking point, something that's easy to dismiss, something that's easy to vilify. But it's a much more, like most issues of public policy, it's much more complicated than the way it looks at first blush. But it's a really critical issue in today's race.
Right. Well, and just the mention of earmarks reminds me of I took a graduate class in public finance and budgeting, and the professor asked, "What is pork?" Mm-hmm. and of course, pork is other states' projects.
Yes.
And so you mentioned your book on earmarks and presidential earmarks, and I think it's that's a issue that most people aren't aware of. When I believe it was in 2010 or 2011 that congressional earmarks went away. I mean, what happened to that money, and what happened to the earmarks as we knew them, appropriated through the congressional side?
So two things happened. One is that members of Congress and senators just found very creative ways to hide earmarks. They call them different things. They found ways to adjust bills that helped. And so Congress got creative with an earmark ban. But the other reality was that it just empowered the president to spend the money as he saw fit. So, and this was something that a lot of Republicans, I shouldn't say a lot, some Republican senators, very conservative Republican senators, made a point of during the debate over the earmark ban. And the idea was, the analogy that I like to use, when you're banning earmarks, you don't shrink the size of the pie. You just determine what the slices look like. So banning earmarks did not cut federal spending at all. Not a penny. Not a single penny of federal spending was cut because of the earmark ban. What it did was it determined which states got how much. And so a state like Mississippi, a state like West Virginia, a state like South Carolina, a state like Alaska that has long depended on very senior senators helping those states out, they were hurt the most by an earmark ban. Alternatively, when the president is empowered, my research shows, my book shows, that swing states benefit, and that makes sense. Swing states benefit under Republican presidents, and they benefit under Democratic presidents. States like Mississippi aren't getting much money, aren't getting additional money from presidents, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, because a Republican knows he's going to win Mississippi and a Democrat knows he's going to lose Mississippi. So what an earmark ban does at the end of the day is it empowers Barack Obama. It empowers George Bush. It empowers Bill Clinton. It empowers whoever the next president is. It doesn't do much. It doesn't do anything to curb federal spending. And so I think that sort of goes back to Senator Cochran's overall point. I'm bringing home federal dollars. I'm bringing home more federal dollars than we would be due if it was just simply handed out per capita. And if I don't do that, some other state is more than willing to take that money off our hands. And it's an important point that's sometimes a little bit hard to make, particularly in a conservative state like Mississippi, but it's a valid point that he makes.
But so I mean, isn't there a bit of irony that fiscal conservatives against taxpayer waste when they agree to end congressional earmarks, that what they're actually doing is they're handing over the authority and discretion for earmarks to President Barack Obama, hardly what they would consider as a fiscal hawk.
Yeah, it is a true irony. Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma was the most vocal opponent of the earmark ban, and that was his reason. He literally said on the House floor, if we take away our constitutional authority to appropriate funds, you're giving that money away to the White House, you're giving that money to Barack Obama. And he's right. But people didn't believe him. People didn't buy it. It wasn't the popular talking point of the day. The popular talking point of the day was ban earmarks and we reduce our deficit. It's wrong. It's just patently false. But people fall for it because there weren't enough people like Senator Inhofe out there defending this idea, defending this point.
Well, okay. Well, my editor's over here writing me a note telling me I got to wrap it up because I've actually got some stories on deadline.
Sure.
But just kind of quickly, so you know, for Mississippi, if Thad Cochran is reelected, not reelected, because of course the winner of the Republican primary advances in the general election, and they're going to likely face former Blue Dog Congressman Travis Childers. But well, if Cochran wins re-election, because you know if he defeats McDaniel, he's widely considered the winner of the general election. But so what is Cochran back in for another 6 years? What does that mean for Mississippi?
Well, what it means for Mississippi depends a bit on what else happens in November. I think he'll continue to do the types of things that he's done, representing conservative values and in being able to bring home the bacon, of course. But if Republicans take control of the Senate, it's widely assumed that if Senator Cochran is reelected, he'll become the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, a profoundly powerful post within the Senate. And so what will you see? You'll see more of the same in Mississippi if Senator Cochran is reelected. And for a lot of Mississippians, they don't think that's half bad. For some Mississippians, they see it as a problem. But for some people, they've been very comfortable with what Senator Cochran has done over the past several decades. And tonight, they might just give him another 6 years.
Okay, and just hang with me for just a second here.
No problem.
Okay, I see that Travis Childers has won the Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate, and I don't think there's been a winner declared in the Republican primary yet. But if McDaniel is Mississippi's next Republican nominee, and somehow he manages to well, if he's the Republican nominee, what does a Republican McDaniel have to look forward to in a race against a Blue Dog Congressman Childers, and if he's elected, what can change?
Well, if Mr. McDaniel wins the nomination tonight, what it means is that he's probably likely favored to win in the fall. At the end of the day, Mississippi is still a very conservative, very Republican state, and any Democrat has a really tough time winning statewide, whether you're a liberal or you're a Blue Dog Democrat. But what it means is that the Republican Party, outside interest groups, and Mr. McDaniel himself are going to have to spend a profound amount of money on this seat in the general election in a way that probably is not going to have to be the case if Senator Cochran wins tonight. And so that can change the dynamics about how money is spread around nationwide. how much money the Republican Party has to support other vulnerable Republicans in other races. And so it actually can have some pretty serious national implications.
I'm sorry, my editor's talking to me. He's saying that right now Cochran has a 53% to 45% lead with just a really small percentage of precincts reporting. There's 236 precincts out of 1,832. So it seems like we could be in for a late night if. I really appreciate Dr. Hudak taking a few minutes to speak with us about this election tonight. This is very fascinating with the dynamics of nationally and for Mississippi, and perhaps you can join us again sometime.
Great, I'd love to, Robbie. Thanks for having me so much.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, and for everyone else out there, keep watching djournal.com for our election results coming in, and we'll see what happens at the end of tonight.